burned roughly 1.5 million pounds of jet fuel. Critics called it total military madness. They were completely wrong. It was pure tactical brilliance. Think about that math for a second. 11 huge fuel tankers launching into the dark alongside 2 heavy bombers, all to land one single direct hit on a lonely island airstrip. How does a military even justify an operation that wild? Most people look at the numbers and assume the mission was a failure because only one bomb hit the runway. But that single crater changed the course of an entire war. This was Operation Black Buck, a mission built on fragile fuel lines, raw courage, and extreme risk over the Atlantic Ocean. So how did things get this wild? Subscribe to this channel, and you'll start noticing how many unusual tactical stories hide right under your nose. To understand why this wild flight happened, you have to go back to April 2nd, 1982. Argentine forces launched a surprise invasion and captured the Falkland Islands. The archipelago sat thousands of miles away, from Great Britain, far beyond the normal reach of British military power. Argentine troops quickly occupied the main airstrip at Port Stanley. That runway was everything. If Argentina stationed high-performance fighter jets on that island, British warships approaching by sea would stand no chance against airstrikes. British military planners knew they had to neutralize that airstrip immediately. But there was an enormous physical problem standing in their way. The nearest usable British airfield sat on Ascension Island, a tiny patch of rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, nearly 3,900 miles away from the target. The distance was brutal. Britain did not have strategic bombers sitting ready for long-range oceanic strikes. In early April 1982, RAF commanders looked at their aging fleet of Avro Vulcan bombers. The aircraft were Cold War relics originally designed to fly short nuclear deterrent routes over Europe. Many of the fuel transfer parts needed to refuel the planes in mid-air had been pulled out years earlier and discarded in dusty storage sheds. Engineers rushed against the clock to track down obsolete components from museums, scrapyards, and airbase desks, retrofitting and welding them back onto the airframes. Aircrews had almost zero recent experience with mid-air refueling, especially over open water at night. They crammed months of training into just a few frantic days, practicing high-altitude fuel transfers while learning how to navigate across vast empty stretches of ocean without modern satellite equipment. On April the 29th, 1982, 2 newly restored Vulcan bombers took off from England and touched down at Wideawake Airfield on Ascension Island. The island was a chaotic hive of military activity. Fuel bladders, bomb racks, and supply crates covered the runway edges. The upcoming mission pushed every physical limit of logistics. A single Vulcan bomber could carry 21 heavy 1,000-pound bombs, but carrying that heavy load required vast amounts of jet fuel. The plane simply could not carry enough fuel in its internal tanks to complete the round trip. The math was relentless. To get just one bomber to the Falklands and back, the RAF had to build a floating pipeline in the sky made entirely of Handley Page Victor refueling tankers. The plan was an airborne game of Leapfrog. Think about how complex this chain was. The Victor tankers themselves needed fuel, just to carry fuel for the bomber. That meant tankers had to refuel other tankers, which would then turn around and head back, leaving a smaller group to fly further south. The final flight plan required 18 separate mid-air refueling transfers, with 7 of those transfers dedicated exclusively to feeding the primary bomber. If a single hose jammed, if a single pump failed, or if fuel consumption ran higher than expected, the bomber would run out of fuel and crash into the freezing ocean. The operational plan left zero room for human error or mechanical failure. Every pilot involved knew the risks, yet they stepped into their cockpits ready to fly straight into the dark. On April 30th, 1982, at exactly 11:50 p.m., the heavy engines roared to life across Ascension Island. 11 Victor refueling tankers and 2 Vulcan bombers taxied down the runway. They launched into the night sky just 60 seconds apart from one another. 13 giant aircraft climbing into total blackness. Strict radio silence was enforced to prevent Argentine listening posts from intercepting the force. Dead silence. No chatter. No navigation beacons. Just black shapes moving through the sky, relying entirely on precise timing and visual contact to maintain formation. This large airborne assembly represented the largest concentration of refueling capability the RAF had ever put into the air at one time. They set their course southwest, heading straight into thousands of miles of empty, unpredictable ocean. Disaster struck almost immediately after takeoff. What do you do when the main bomber loses air pressure over the ocean? Minutes into the climb, the main Vulcan bomber suffered a sudden failure. A rubber window seal on the pilot's side failed to seal properly. Cold air rushed into the cockpit, making it impossible to pressurize the cabin. Pilot John Reeve had no choice. He had to abort the mission and turn back toward Ascension Island. But he couldn't just land. The Vulcan was weighed down with thousands of pounds of fuel and 21 heavy bombs. Landing at that weight would snap the landing gear and cause a huge explosion. The crew sat in a freezing, noisy cabin for hours, circling in the dark just to burn enough fuel to touch down safely. That left the backup aircraft, flown by pilot Martin Withers, completely alone. Withers had launched as a contingency, expecting to turn back early if the main plane operated smoothly. Instead, he was now the sole tip of the spear. Withers looked at his crew and calmly said, "Looks like we've got a job of work, fellers." That was it. No drama, no panic. Just 6 men stepping up to execute an impossible raid. Suddenly, the entire weight of the mission fell onto a backup crew tasked with executing complex night aerial refueling over hostile territory. They had to fly deep into hostile territory with no support aircraft behind them. One mistake meant falling straight into the dark ocean. They pushed their throttles forward and continued south into the black sky. If this story is hitting different, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this to more people who need to see it. As May 1st, 1982 dawned over the Atlantic, the weather turned violent. Severe electrical storms slammed into the formation. Heavy rain and violent turbulence shook the aircraft, throwing the heavy tankers around like toys. How do you find a tiny refueling probe in total dark during a tropical storm? It takes sheer nerve. During one critical fuel transfer in the heavy weather, the refueling probe on the receiving Victor tanker snapped clean off. Fuel sprayed into the stormy air. That lead tanker was instantly rendered useless for refueling other planes. The intricate fuel schedule collapsed instantly. The remaining aircraft were suddenly short on fuel, far from home, with the bomber still hundreds of miles away from its target zone. The entire operation came down to split-second decision-making. Tanker pilot Bob Tuxford realized the mission would fail, right there unless someone stepped up. Tuxford coordinated an emergency roll swap in the middle of the storm, positioning his Victor tanker to deliver fuel directly to Withers' Vulcan bomber. But there was a terrifying catch. Giving that extra fuel to the bomber meant Tuxford was giving away his own return margin. He knew he would not have enough fuel left to guarantee his own safe return to Ascension Island. He drained his tanks past the safety limit anyway to keep the strike alive. That's courage. Pure leadership. Tuxford gave the Vulcan the fuel it needed and turned his empty tanker back into the storm alone. With its fuel tanks finally topped off, Martin Withers pushed the Vulcan bomber toward the Falkland Islands. Argentine radar bases on the islands were actively scanning the skies for incoming attacks. To avoid early detection, Withers dropped the heavy 4-engine bomber down to just 300 feet above the ocean surface. Flying 300 feet above sea level in pitch darkness is terrifying. The ocean waves rushed past just beneath the aircraft's belly. The crew flew under enemy radar coverage for over 200 miles. As they closed in on Port Stanley, Withers pulled the control stick back, climbing rapidly to 10,000 feet to align the bomber with the target airstrip. May 1st, 1982, 4:38 a.m. local time. Dead silence over the island. The bomb bay doors slid open. Withers lined up the aircraft across the Port Stanley runway at a 35-degree angle to maximize the chance of striking the paved surface. The crew released 21 1,000-pound bombs in rapid succession. Heavy explosions rocked the airfield, shaking the earth and waking the enemy defenders. Out of 21 heavy bombs dropped across the site, exactly 1 bomb hit the runway directly. Just 1. The remaining bombs fell along the edges and surrounding support facilities, though 5 failed to explode. The Vulcan banked hard, slammed its throttles to full power, and climbed out into the night sky before enemy anti-aircraft guns could lock on. Critics looking purely at the numbers called the mission an expensive failure. 1 hit out of 21 bombs sounds like terrible math. Classic surface-level analysis. They completely missed the strategic reality. That single crater right in the middle of the Port Stanley runway rendered the airstrip useless for high-performance enemy jet fighters. Although the short runway was already unsuitable for heavy Mirage jets, the attack ensured Argentina could not use or easily expand the airstrip for fast jets. Even more important, the raid sent a shockwave through the Argentine military leadership in Buenos Aires. If a British bomber could carry out an 8,000-mile round-trip raid, It could strike targets on the Argentine mainland. The raid demonstrated British long-range striking capability, forcing Argentine planners to keep air defenses on high alert along their entire southern mainland coastline. That single bomb saved the Navy. The attack was over, but the crew's struggle for survival was just beginning. Withers turned the Vulcan back north, but his fuel meters were dropping toward empty at an alarming rate. The bomber was burning fuel faster than projected during the high-speed escape. Out over the endless water, the crew of the lead Victor tanker calculated they would run out of fuel hundreds of miles before reaching Ascension Island. The Victor tanker crew sent out an urgent signal for fuel assistance. Miles ahead in the darkness, a lone Victor tanker piloted by Barry Neal was flying south to find them, running on minimal fuel margins itself. Clouds blocked the horizon. Suddenly, Neal's tanker broke through the cloud deck, just 3 miles ahead of the starving bomber. Withers later called it the most beautiful sight in the world. The Vulcan connected to the tanker's hose, took on needed fuel, and landed safely at Ascension Island after 15 hours and 45 minutes of continuous flight. At the time, it set the record for the longest bombing mission in aviation history, an 8,000-mile round trip executed across a razor-thin margin of error. The legacy of that flight still resonates today. By May 2026, the famous Vulcan XM607, the actual plane flown during that historical raid, was undergoing a full preservation project at RAF Waddington to ensure its history stays preserved. In 2026, Craftsman even launched a special wristwatch called the AV-1 Vulcan, using real aluminum recovered directly from XM607's wing. It stands as a physical tribute to an impossible mission. They launched 11 refueling planes, burned nearly 1.5 million pounds of jet fuel, and pushed human endurance to the very edge, all to drop one single bomb onto a distant runway. Who risks an entire fleet of planes for a single target? It was not a waste of resources. It was one of the most brilliant, high-stakes military gambles ever taken. That single bomb reshaped the entire war and proved what courage and determination can accomplish when failure is not an option. If any of this stuck with you, like and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.